If you are a woman over the age of 60, I would like to ask you something that might feel a little bit personal. Have you ever noticed yourself retreating into certain familiar routines that, while they may bring you a sense of comfort, perhaps also leave you feeling more tired, less connected to the world, or not quite yourself? For a great many women in this particular stage of life, a quiet and insidious habit begins to develop. It might be the act of settling into the very same chair each and every evening, of pouring that one nightly glass of wine, of reaching for a small and comforting dessert, or of spending many hours in front of the television or scrolling endlessly online. These moments can certainly feel safe, familiar, and deeply comforting. And yet, over the course of time, when they begin to replace a sense of true and genuine human connection, of regular movement, and of proper nourishment, they can then begin to quietly and insidiously chip away at your precious energy, at the health of your heart, at the clarity of your mind, and even at the quality of your personal relationships. My name is DrLilyStones. I have been a physician practicing in the field of women's health for more than 30 years now. And in that time, I have had the profound privilege of walking alongside thousands of women through all of the complex and often challenging changes of menopause and of the aging process. And in that time, I have been able to see both sides of this particular story. I have been able to see women who are able to feel vibrant, resilient, and deeply and profoundly connected, well into their 70s. And I have also been able to see women who are struggling with a sense of persistent fatigue, of a pervasive mental fogginess, of a profound emotional distance, and of a noticeable physical weakness, all of which they will often blame on the simple and the unavoidable act of just getting older. But the process of aging, in and of itself, is not the full and complete story. A great many of these very same struggles will often come from a set of deeply ingrained habits that no longer serve the needs of the body in its later decades of life. What had once felt to be completely harmless or even restorative can, in the years after the age of 60, begin to trigger a veritable cascade of negative changes that can quietly and insidiously drain your own innate sense of vitality. Now, I so very deeply and so very profoundly want to be perfectly and completely clear with you about all of this. This is not at all a matter of any kind of a judgment. The practice of solitary routines, whether it is the enjoyment of a favorite television show, the challenge of a puzzle, or the simple pleasure of a sweet treat, are not at all inherently bad. They will only ever begin to become concerning when they begin to completely and utterly replace the delicate and the crucial sense of balance that your very own body so deeply and so desperately needs in order to be able to stay strong and healthy. And here is the wonderfully and the beautifully hopeful truth of the matter: with just a few small and simple shifts in your daily habits, you can absolutely and completely begin to restore that very same sense of balance. You can begin to feel lighter, you can begin to feel more energized, and you can also begin to feel so much more present with all of the many different people who matter the very most to you. And over the course of this entire series, I am going to be walking you through 5 very real and very science-backed effects that are able to happen when women who are over the age of 60 begin to rely on the use of these solitary comforts. And please know that these are not at all rare or unusual occurrences. In fact, you may very well begin to recognize a part of yourself in some of these very same stories. And I will also be sure to share with all of you some very practical and some very natural ways for you to be able to respond to all of this, so that you can then be able to protect your own personal health without having to lose all of the many small and of the many simple joys that are able to bring you a sense of comfort. But before we dive into all of those important lessons, please allow me to pause for just a moment to be able to invite you to take just one single and simple action. And if you are at all interested in having some honest and some compassionate conversations about the subject of your health in your later years of life, I would so deeply and so profoundly want to be able to encourage all of you to be able to subscribe to this particular channel. And please know that this is a very special and a very beautiful space that has been built for women who are just like you. A space where the principles of science and of a profound sense of warmth are able to go hand in hand with one another. And if what I am saying to you right now is already beginning to resonate with you, I would be so very honored if you would please be sure to leave me a simple "Hoan" in the comments section below. And if you are not at all sure just yet, then I would be so very grateful if you would please be sure to type a simple "2" in the comments section below. And please know that your very own personal feedback is what is able to help me to be able to create the kind of content that is able to truly and completely serve you. Now, let's go ahead and start with the very first and with perhaps the very most common warning sign of all of this, a sense of a fatigue that is able to run so much deeper than just a simple and a pure state of a tiredness. And while a great many women will so often chalk it all up to their own age, there is, in fact, often so much more that is going on just beneath the surface. I will never, ever be able to forget the story of Brenda, who was a 68-year-old retired teacher, and who had once walked into my own office, looking completely and utterly drained. She had said to me, "Dr. Stones, I just simply and purely do not understand it at all. I am able to sleep for a full 8 hours every single night, and I am also able to eat fairly well. But I am still able to wake up in the morning, feeling completely and utterly exhausted. And I then have to be sure to take a nap, just to be able to make it through the rest of the day." And when I had then asked her to be able to tell me a little bit more about her own evenings, she had then admitted to me, "Most nights, I will simply and purely try to unwind with a simple glass of wine and with a simple slice of cake, all while I am watching some television. And it is the only single thing that is able to relax me." And this is a very same story that I have been able to hear countless numbers of times. And what is at first able to seem to be a completely and an utterly harmless routine can, in fact, be able to place a very heavy and a very significant burden on your own body in the years after the age of 60. And here is precisely why, as we are all able to begin to age, our own metabolism and all of our own hormone systems are able to become so much more delicate and so much more sensitive. And the esteemed Mayo Clinic has been able to note that older adults are so much more sensitive to any kind of a fluctuation in their own blood sugar levels, and that even some very modest and some very small amounts of an alcohol can be able to disrupt their own natural sleep cycles. And that very same nightly ritual of a wine and of a dessert had been sending Brenda's own blood sugar levels soaring, only to then have them come crashing down a little bit later. And the inevitable result of all of this was a state of a sleep that had at first looked to be quite long on the clock, but that had, in fact, been very shallow and very unrestful. And her own levels of the hormone cortisol, the primary stress hormone in her own body, had also then been being disturbed, which had then been able to create a vicious and a self-perpetuating cycle of a systemic inflammation and of a profound hormonal imbalance. And this is precisely why so very many women are able to describe to me a state of a bone-deep weariness, of a very sluggish form of a thinking, or of a profound lack of a motivation, even after what they had thought had been a full and a complete night of a rest. And please know that this is not at all just simply and purely a matter of your own aging. It is, in fact, your very own body's natural and predictable response to a set of some very deeply and of some very profoundly ingrained habits that no longer at all match its own current and its own unique needs. And in our own younger years of life, our own bodies are able to bounce back from all of this very, very quickly. But after the age of 60, our own process of a recovery is able to take a much, much longer period of time. And when Brenda and I had then been able to work together, I had not at all told her that she had to be giving up on her own sense of a comfort. And instead, we had simply and purely been able to shift it, and she had then been able to swap out her own nightly glass of wine for a much more calming and for a much more soothing cup of a chamomile tea, and her own nightly slice of a dessert for just a simple handful of some fresh and of some delicious cherries. And she had also then been able to create for herself a very calming and a very soothing bedtime routine, with some very light and with some very gentle stretching and with a favorite and a beloved book. And within just 6 short weeks, her own energy levels had been completely and utterly transformed. And her own husband had even been able to notice that she was now smiling so much more. And she had then said to me, "I feel as though I have now been able to get my very own inner spark back." And that is the very same message that I so very deeply and so very profoundly want for all of you to be able to take to your own heart. Your very own body is not at all failing you. It is, in fact, simply and purely communicating with you. And when you are able to feel a profound and a persistent sense of a fatigue, it is not at all just simply and purely a matter of your own old age. It is, in fact, a very clear and a very direct signal that is asking you for a different and a much more compassionate kind of a care. And when you are then able to respond to that very same signal, the rewards that you are able to receive can be truly and utterly remarkable. But a sense of a fatigue is only just the very beginning of this story, because the very same patterns that are able to drain your very own energy are also able to place a very hidden and a very insidious strain on another very important and very integral part of your very own body, one that we simply and purely cannot at all afford to be able to ignore: your very own heart. And that is exactly where we are going to be heading next. When we begin to think about the process of aging, a great many women will fully and completely expect to be able to feel a little bit slower and perhaps a little bit more tired. But far, far fewer of them will ever at all be able to expect that something so very ordinary as the simple and the pure act of sitting for some very long and for some very extended periods of your own time, or of the simple and the pure act of reaching for some snacks while you are browsing online, could be able to quietly and insidiously place a very significant and a very profound strain on the very most vital and the very most important muscle in your very entire and your very complete body, your very own heart. And yet, this is exactly what I am able to see in my very own clinical practice on a very regular and on a very consistent basis. And it is something that is able to matter so very much, simply because, according to the National Institutes of Health, the condition of a heart disease is still the #1 and the leading cause of a death for all of the many women who are over the age of 65. And what is able to make all of this so especially and so particularly concerning is the very fact that all of the many different and distinct warning signs of this condition can be so very subtle, and that they can also so often be disguised as just a normal and an unavoidable part of the aging process, or as just a simple and a pure form of a stress. And I can still so vividly remember the story of Carol, who was a 72-year-old grandmother and who had first come in to see me for what she had thought would be just a simple and a pure routine checkup. And she had had a great love for the practice of a gardening. And she had also taken a great deal of a real and of a genuine pride in her own ability to be able to eat very well. And on the very surface of it all, she had seemed to be the very picture of a good health. But as we had then begun to talk a little bit more, she had then admitted to me something, in a very hesitant and in a very uncertain way. She had said, "Dr. Stones, I have now gotten into the very bad habit of spending many hours online. Sometimes I am shopping, and sometimes I am just simply and purely scrolling. And I will then also be sure to snack while I am doing it. And right afterwards, my own heart is able to feel as though it is fluttering. Is that at all normal?" And that very same question had then been able to stop me right in my very own tracks, simply because I had known in that very same moment that it was not at all just simply and purely a matter of her own nerves. And Carol's very personal story is a very common and a very familiar one. And when you are able to combine some very long and of some very extended hours of a sitting with some very sugary or with some very salty snacks, your very own heart and all of your very own delicate blood vessels are then able to experience what I have come to be able to call a double hit. And first of all, the profound and the deep lack of a movement is able to mean that your very own circulation is then able to slow down, that your very own blood pressure is then able to begin to rise, and that all of your very own muscles, and that includes your very own heart, are no longer able to get all of the very vital and all of the very essential oxygen that they so deeply and so desperately need. And second of all of the many different and distinct processed foods that will so often be able to accompany all of these very same routines are able to spike your very own blood sugar levels and are also able to trigger a state of a systemic inflammation, both of which are able to place a great deal of a stress on your very own cardiovascular system. And while your very own body may be able to feel as though it is in a very relaxed state in the moment, on the inside, it is very much like it is running a very quiet and a very insidious marathon. And when I had then taken the time to be able to measure Carol's very own blood pressure, it had, in fact, been slightly above the very healthy and the very optimal range for her. Not at all high enough to be able to need any kind of a medication just yet, but it was, in fact, a very clear and a very direct warning sign. And a great many women do not at all be able to realize that a state of a blood pressure that is even just a little bit above the normal range can be able to double their very own personal risk of a heart disease over the course of time. And according to the American Heart Association, a variety of different and distinct lifestyle habits, such as your very own diet, your very own level of an activity, and your very own level of a stress management, are all able to play a much more powerful and a much more significant role than most of the many different and distinct medications that are currently available on the market when it comes to the very important and the very integral matter of a prevention. And that is precisely why the act of being able to catch this very same pattern at a very early stage is so very important. And so, together, we had then begun to work on some very small and on some very realistic changes for her. And I had not at all asked Carol to be able to give up on her own online time, but I had, in fact, been able to encourage her to please try to set a timer for herself and to then be sure to stand up on every single 30 minutes. And she had then begun to walk all around her own house. She had then begun to do some very light and of some very gentle stretching, or she had then just simply and purely been able to step outside of her own home in order to be able to breathe in some very fresh and of some very clean air. And we had then also been able to replace all of her very own processed snacks with just a very small and with a very simple bowl of some almonds and of some blueberries. Some very delicious and some very nutritious foods that have been clearly and definitively shown to be able to support the overall health of your very own heart. And instead of her just simply and purely scrolling in a state of a silence, I had then also been able to suggest to her that she please try to call a friend for just 10 short minutes of her own time. And that very same shift had then been able to give to her both a sense of a movement and a sense of a connection. And within just a few short weeks, Carol's very own fluttering sensation had then been able to completely and utterly disappear, and her very own blood pressure readings had then been able to improve. And she had then said to me something that I will never, ever be able to forget: I now feel as though I am not at all afraid of my very own body anymore. And that is the very same kind of a transformation that I so very deeply and so very profoundly want for every single woman who is listening to me here today. And it is not at all about any sense of a perfection. It is, in fact, all about the profound and the beautiful process of being able to give to your very own heart all of the many small and of the many simple acts of a care that it so deeply and so desperately needs. Now, another very important and very integral piece of all of this that a great many women will so often overlook is the very profound and the very significant role of their very own emotional sense of a well-being. And the esteemed Mayo Clinic has been able to clearly and definitively highlight the very fact that the feelings of a loneliness and of an isolation are both very strongly and very directly linked to a much higher level of a cardiovascular risk. And when a series of some very solitary and of some very isolated habits are able to begin to replace a sense of a genuine and of a heartfelt human connection, your very own heart is then not at all only able to suffer on a purely physical level, but it is also able to suffer on a deeply and on a profoundly emotional one as well. And a very quiet and a very silent house, some very endless and of some very extended hours on a screen, or some very lonely and of some very silent evenings, without any kind of a meaningful form of a conversation, may at first look to be quite peaceful to you. But your very own body will so often be able to interpret it all as a form of a stress. And that very same stress, especially when it is in a chronic and in a prolonged state, is able to raise the very same levels of the hormone cortisol in your very own body. It is able to increase your very own blood pressure. And it is also able to put a much further and a much greater strain on your very own cardiovascular system. And the wonderfully and the beautifully hopeful part of all of this is this: your very own heart is a remarkably and an incredibly responsive thing. And even in your very own 60s and in your very own 70s, some very small and of some very simple changes can be able to produce some very measurable and of some very significant improvements. And some very short and of some very leisurely walks, right after your very own meals, can be able to help you to be able to regulate your very own blood sugar levels, and can also be able to help you to be able to lower your very own blood pressure. And some very gentle and of some very mindful breathing exercises can be able to calm your very own nervous system. And the simple and the pure act of choosing some very whole and of some very unprocessed foods, such as some leafy greens, some berries, and some salmon, can all be able to support a much healthier and a much more resilient state of your very own arteries. And most importantly of all, the simple and the pure act of staying in a socially connected state is able to give to your very own heart both a sense of an emotional warmth and a sense of a physical resilience. I will so often tell my very own patients that their very own heart is so much more than just a simple and a pure pump. It is, in fact, a living and a breathing and a very responsive muscle that is able to reflect not only what you are able to eat and how you are able to move, but also how you are able to live and who you are able to connect with. And if you are able to nurture it with a profound and with a beautiful sense of an intention, it can then be able to serve you with a great deal of a strength and of a stability for a very long and for a very healthy time, well into your very own later years of life. But the health of your very own heart is only just one single and simple part of this entire and complete story. Because, as a great many women are able to discover for themselves, the very same patterns that are able to fatigue the very own body, and that are also able to strain the very own heart, can also be able to cloud the very center of your very own identity, your very own mind. And if you have ever been able to walk into a room and have then completely and utterly forgotten why you had gone there in the first place, or if you have ever been able to struggle to be able to recall a very simple and a very familiar name, or if you have ever been able to feel an unshakable and a pervasive fog over all of your very own thoughts, then you are most certainly able to know just how very, very unsettling that can be. And that is exactly where we are going to be heading next. The very hidden and the very insidious connection between all of these very same solitary habits and all of the many different and distinct memory lapses that you may be experiencing. Have you ever found yourself walking into a room only to completely and utterly forget why you had gone in there in the first place? Or have you ever found yourself searching in vain for a particular word that is usually right there on the very tip of your tongue? A great many women who are over the age of 60 will often describe this particular experience as being just a normal part of getting older. But what I so very deeply and so very profoundly want for you to be able to know is that all of these very same moments of a forgetfulness will often have so much more to do with your own personal lifestyle habits than they will with the process of an aging in and of itself. And in fact, a great deal of a recent research that has been conducted by the National Institute on Aging has been able to clearly and definitively show that, while some of the many different and distinct cognitive changes are, in fact, a normal and an expected part of the aging process, a great many others of them can be able to be influenced, either in a positive or in a negative way, by what you are able to eat, by how you are able to move, and by how you are able to spend all of your very own quiet and of your very own solitary hours. And I can still so vividly think of the story of Roberta, who was a retired teacher in her early 70s, and who had first come to see me with a great many tears in her very own eyes. "Dr. Stones," she had said to me, "I am now beginning to forget things. And not at all the very big and of the very important things, but all of the many different and distinct little ones, such as where I have put my own keys, why I have just now walked into a room, or sometimes even just the very name of a student from many, many years ago. And my very own daughter is now beginning to worry that it could possibly be a form of a dementia. But then, on some other days, I am able to feel as sharp as I ever have been. And so, what is happening to me?" And so, we had then taken the time to be able to run a series of some very comprehensive tests, and all of her very own brain scans had then come back completely and utterly clear. And there had not at all been any kind of a sign of a dementia at all. And that had, of course, been some very good and of some very wonderful news, but it had not at all been able to answer her very own question. And so, I had then asked her to be able to tell me a little bit more about her very own daily routines. And that is when she had then admitted to me, "Most nights, I will simply and purely sit down with a very big bag of some chips and will then just simply and purely watch some very old movies. And it is my very own personal form of a comfort." And Roberta's very personal story is a very common and a very familiar one. And a great many women will unknowingly and unwittingly be able to fuel their very own sense of a brain fog through a series of some very deeply and of some very profoundly ingrained patterns of eating and of an inactivity, and all of the many different and distinct processed carbohydrates and all of the many different and distinct sugars that they are able to consume are able to send their very own blood sugar levels soaring, only to then have them come crashing all the way back down. And each and every single one of those very same spikes and of those very same dips is able to create a state of a systemic inflammation that does not at all just affect their very own bodies. It is also able to directly and profoundly impact their very own brains. And according to a number of different and distinct studies that have been published in the esteemed medical journal Neurology, a state of a high blood sugar and of a poor state of a metabolic control are both very strongly and very directly linked to a state of a cognitive decline, even in all of the many different and distinct older adults who are not at all living with a state of a diabetes. And when you are then able to add into all of this some very long and of some very extended hours of a sitting, of a very limited amount of a movement, and of a profound and of a deep sense of an emotional isolation, you are then able to create the very perfect and the very ideal environment for a state of a foggy thinking to be able to occur. And it is not at all only your own personal sense of a memory that is able to suffer all of your very own neurotransmitters, all of those very tiny and of those very intricate chemical messengers that are able to allow your very own brain to be able to focus, to be able to learn, and to be able to regulate your very own mood, are also then able to take a very big and a very significant hit. And when your very own brain is able to be flooded with a host of different and distinct inflammatory signals, the very same levels of the neurochemicals serotonin and dopamine in your very own brain may then begin to dip. And that is precisely why so very many women will so often say to me that they are not at all only able to forget things, but that they are also then able to feel so very unmotivated, so very low in their own overall mood, or so very disconnected from themselves. And it is able to feel to them as if a very gray and a very heavy cloud has now been able to settle over their very own minds. And because this particular feeling is able to come and to go, they will so often just simply and purely be able to dismiss it all as just being a simple and a pure state of a tiredness. And the wonderfully and the beautifully encouraging news in all of this is that your very own brain is, in fact, a very adaptable and a very resilient thing. And just as some very poor and of some very unhealthy habits are able to trigger a state of a fog, some much better and of some much healthier habits are then able to clear it all away. And for Roberta, we had then decided to start with some very small and with some very simple steps. And she had then begun to cut back on her own nightly consumption of some chips, and she had also then begun to replace them with just a few simple and delicious walnuts and with some very fresh and of some very crisp apple slices. Some very delicious and some very nutritious foods that are so very rich in some omega-3 fatty acids and in some very powerful and very potent antioxidants that are all able to support the overall function of your very own brain. And she had also then begun to make the practice of a proper and of a sufficient hydration a daily and a consistent priority for herself, since even just a very mild state of a dehydration can be able to impair your very own personal sense of a memory. And she had also then begun to walk outdoors just 3 times a week, and she had then been able to combine a very gentle and a very leisurely form of an exercise with some very fresh and of some very clean air and with a sufficient amount of a sunlight. And within just 2 short months, her very own daughter had then laughed and had said to me, "My own mom is now able to remember my very own birthday once again, and I will be sure to take that as a proof." And Roberta herself had then said to me that she had felt as though a very thick and a very heavy veil had now been lifted from her very own mind. And what is so very powerful about all of the many different and distinct stories that are just like hers is that they are all able to show to you that you do not at all need to be taking any kind of a drastic or of an overwhelming measure in order to be able to reclaim your own personal sense of a mental clarity. And the National Institute on Aging is able to emphasize the very fact that a well-balanced and a very nutritious diet, a regular and a consistent form of an activity, and some very mentally engaging and of some very stimulating tasks, such as the simple acts of a reading, of a doing of some puzzles, or of a learning of something new, are all able to help you to be able to protect your very own personal sense of a memory. And I will also be sure to add to all of this that the simple and the pure act of a social connection is a very powerful and a very profound form of a medicine for your very own brain. And all of the many different and distinct conversations, of all of the many different and distinct moments of a laughter, and of all of the many different and distinct shared experiences that you are able to have with other people, are all able to light up a host of different and distinct neural pathways in your very own brain, in a way that all of the many different and distinct solitary habits never possibly could. And if you have, in fact, been struggling with a sense of a brain fog, I so very deeply and so very profoundly want for you to be able to take a great deal of a heart from all of this. And please know that a state of a forgetfulness does not at all mean that you are in any way broken, and it also does not at all mean that a state of a dementia is in any way inevitable for you. And very often, it is simply and purely your very own brain's own personal way of asking you for a much steadier and for a much more reliable source of a fuel, and for a much richer and for a much more stimulating form of a stimulation. And I would like for you to please try to think of it as being like a beautiful and a vibrant garden. And when that very same garden is left all on its own, without any kind of a water or of a sunlight, all of the many beautiful and of the many vibrant flowers that are in that very same garden will then begin to wilt. But with just a little bit of a daily and of a consistent form of an attention, they are then all able to bloom once again. And your very own mind is not at all any different from that. So, as you are taking a moment right now to be able to reflect on all of your very own personal habits, I would like for you to please try to ask yourself, are you currently nourishing your very own brain, or are you, in fact, unintentionally clouding it with a series of some very different and of some very distinct choices that no longer at all serve you? And the profound and the beautiful beauty of this particular stage of your own life is that a state of a positive and of a beneficial change is always and at all times possible for you. And I have personally been able to see a great many different and distinct women who are in their 70s and who are in their 80s be able to sharpen their very own minds, be able to regain their very own focus, and be able to feel so very joyfully and so very present once again, simply and purely by the simple act of rebalancing the very same way that they are able to spend all of their very own evenings. But while a state of a brain fog can be so very unsettling, there is also another very powerful and very profound effect of a solitary form of a withdrawal that can be even more painful than that. A profound and a deep sense of an emotional distance from all of the many different and distinct people who matter the very most to you. And that is exactly what we are now in need of being able to talk about next. How all of these very same habits are able to quietly and insidiously reshape your very own personal relationships, very often without you ever even at all realizing it. One of the very quietest, and yet also one of the most painful changes that I am able to see in the lives of the women who are over the age of 60 is not at all a purely physical one. It is, in fact, a deeply and a profoundly emotional one. And over the course of time, all of the many different and distinct, solitary comforts can be able to gradually and to insidiously replace a sense of a real and of a genuine human connection. And at first, it may not at all feel to you like some kind of a problem. And you may at first just simply and purely be able to tell yourself that you are just simply and purely enjoying all of your own very favorite television shows, of all of your own very favorite puzzles, or of all of your own very favorite hobbies. And you have most certainly been able to earn this particular time for yourself, and you most certainly have. But little by little, that very same habit of a retreating inward can be able to create a profound and a deep sense of a distance, not at all just from the entire and the complete world, but also from all of the many different and distinct people that you so deeply and so truly love the very most. And I can still so vividly think of the story of Theresa, who was a 74-year-old woman, and who had once sat across from me on one single and simple afternoon, with her own hands trembling as she had spoken. "Dr. Stones," she had said to me very quietly, "my own husband now thinks that I do not at all love him anymore. And he has said to me that I have now pulled away from him, and he is not at all wrong. And I just simply and purely do not at all know how to be able to fix it." And she had then admitted to me that whenever she had been able to feel so very lonely or so very uncertain, she had then always and at all times been able to turn to her very own private and her very own personal world of a television, of some puzzles, and of some books. And while it had, in fact, been able to give to her a profound and a deep sense of a comfort, it had also then been able to keep her from being able to reach out for her very own husband's hand, from being able to share her very own feelings with him, or from being able to initiate any kind of an intimacy with him. And the profound truth of the matter was that her very own solitary habits had then begun to completely and utterly replace the very same warmth of her very own marriage. And this is something that I am so very often able to see. And as our very own bodies are able to change with our very own age, the experience of an intimacy may then begin to feel so very different to us. And all of the many different and distinct hormonal shifts that are able to occur can be able to lower our very own sense of a desire, and all of the many different and distinct aches and pains or a state of a dryness that we may be experiencing can be able to make the experience of a closeness feel so very uncomfortable. And a profound and a deep sense of a fear of a rejection can then be able to create a profound and a deep sense of a silence. And instead of them being able to address all of these very same issues in an open and in an honest way, a great many women will then simply and purely be able to retreat into some much safer and into some much more solitary routines. Not at all because they have in any way been able to stop loving their very own partner, but simply because the act of a withdrawal is able to feel so much easier to them than the act of a vulnerability. And yet, over the course of time, the cost of this particular choice is a very high one. And that very same emotional form of a withdrawal is able to create an invisible and an impenetrable wall. And all of the many different and distinct moments of a shared laughter, of some very deep and of some very meaningful conversations, and of all of the many small and of the many simple touches that had once come so very naturally to them are then able to become so very rare. And the very relationship itself is then able to shift from a state of a vibrant and of a beautiful partnership to a state of a quiet and of a silent coexistence. And the science is able to fully and completely support what Theresa had been able to feel. A number of different and distinct studies that have been published by the American Psychological Association have all been able to clearly and definitively show that the feelings of a social isolation and of an emotional disconnection are both able to increase our own personal risk of a depression. They are able to weaken our own immune systems, and they can even be able to shorten our very own lifespan. And the esteemed Mayo Clinic is also able to remind us all that our own personal and meaningful relationships are not at all any kind of an extra in our own lives, but they are, in fact, an absolute and an utter essential to the process of a healthy aging. And a sense of a connection is able to fuel our very own mental health. It is able to lower our very own levels of our stress hormones. And it is also able to give to us a profound and a deep sense of a belonging that all of the many different and distinct, solitary habits never possibly could be able to replace. And the wonderfully and the beautifully hopeful news in all of this is that the process of a rebuilding of your own sense of an intimacy and of a connection does not at all have to require any kind of a grand gesture. And for Theresa and for her own husband, we had decided to start with some very small and with some very simple steps. And she had then begun to share her very own feelings with him in a much more open and in a much more honest way. I have now been retreating, she had said to him, simply because I am now feeling so very embarrassed about all of the many different and distinct changes that are now happening in my very own body. And that one single and simple conversation had then been able to open the very door to a sense of a compassion, rather than to a sense of a conflict. And they had also then begun to start a daily and a consistent walk together, not at all a very long one, and not at all a very demanding one, but just simply and purely some very precious and some very beautiful time that they could be able to spend side by side with one another. And within just a few short weeks, she had then told me that all of their many different and distinct conversations had then begun to feel so much lighter to them, and that she had also then begun to feel so much less afraid of a sense of a closeness with him. And her own husband had then been able to notice all of this too. "It is as if I have now been able to get my very own wife back," he had said to me. "And what I so very deeply and so very profoundly want for all of you to be able to know is this: the act of a withdrawing into a state of a solitary form of a comfort is never at all about any kind of a lack of a love. It is, in fact, usually all about a host of different and distinct, unspoken fears of a state of a physical discomfort, or of some simple and of some pure habits that had simply and purely become so much easier for you to do than the act of a reaching out." And the wonderfully and the beautifully good news in all of this is that the experience of an intimacy and of a connection can be able to be rebuilt at any age. And whether it is through the simple and the pure acts of a touch, of a conversation, or of some shared experiences, the very smallest of all of the many different and distinct steps can be able to breathe a brand new and a much more beautiful life into your very own personal relationships. So, I would now like to be able to encourage all of you to please try to ask yourselves, have you ever been able to notice for yourselves any kind of a moment where a sense of a comfort has been able to replace a sense of a connection? And do you now find yourselves choosing a state of a silence over a state of a sharing, or a state of a distraction over a state of a presence? And please know that all of these very same things are not at all any kind of a sign of a failure on your part. They are, in fact, just simply and purely some very clear and of some very direct signals that your very own heart and your very own personal relationships are now ready for a brand new and for a much more profound sense of an attention. And when you are then able to respond to all of those very same signals, You may then be able to discover for yourselves a much deeper and a much more tender bond than you had ever at all been able to experience before. But while a state of an emotional isolation can be so very invisible, the very next consequence of a solitary form of a withdrawal is so much harder to be able to ignore. Because when all of the many different and distinct habits that are able to weaken your very own body are able to go completely and utterly unaddressed, your very own body will then begin to push back in some very real and in some very physical ways. And that is exactly what we are now in need of being able to talk about next. How a sedentary and a withdrawn form of a lifestyle can be able to lead to a state of a physical weakness, of an instability, and even of a profound loss of your own personal independence. And also what you can be able to do to be able to protect your very own strength. When we begin to think about the subject of a strength, a great many women will so often imagine for themselves the act of lifting some very heavy weights or of running in some very long and in some very difficult marathons. But in truth, the very same kind of a strength that is able to matter the very most of all, after the age of 60, is a much more practical one. It is, in fact, the very same kind of a strength that is able to allow you to be able to stand up in a very steady and in a very confident way, to be able to carry your very own groceries without any kind of a strain, to be able to laugh without any kind of a fear of a leaking of any urine, and to be able to walk with a profound and with a deep sense of a confidence, instead of with a profound and with a deep sense of a worry. And here is where all of the many different and distinct solitary and sedentary routines are able to reveal their very greatest and their very most significant cost. Because when you are able to spend the vast majority of your own days just simply and purely sitting, your very own body will then begin to gradually and to insidiously lose the very same muscle tone that is able to protect your own sense of a balance, your very own pelvic floor, and your very own personal sense of an independence. Gloria, who was a very witty and a very sharp 78-year-old woman with a profound and a deep love for the act of a reading, had once come into my own office on one single and simple winter day, and usually she was so very full of a humor, but on that very same afternoon, her own voice had been so very low. DrLilyStones, she had admitted to me, I am now beginning to feel so very fragile. And I had almost been able to fall, just by simply and purely reaching for something. And I have also now started to be leaking just a little bit, whenever I am able to laugh. And so, what is happening to me? And when I had then asked her to be able to tell me a little bit more about her very own daily routine, she had then looked down. I am now able to spend the vast majority of my own time in my very own chair, just simply and purely reading and watching some television, she had said. And I had simply thought that I had been able to earn the right to be able to rest. But now, I am just simply and purely feeling so very broken. And Gloria's very personal experience is so much more common than most of us are ever at all able to realize. And here is the profound truth of the matter. All of the many different and distinct core and pelvic floor muscles that are able to hold your very own body in a very steady and in a very stable state are just like every single other muscle that is in your very own body. And you can simply and purely be able to use them, and they will then be sure to stay strong. Or you can simply and purely be able to neglect them, and they will then be sure to weaken. And after the onset of your own menopause, the very same declining levels of the hormone estrogen in your very own body are able to accelerate the process of a muscle loss, which is then able to make a state of an inactivity even so much more risky for you. And according to the National Institute on Aging, all of the many different and distinct adults who are over the age of 65 can be able to lose up to 1% of their very own muscle mass on each and every single year, without the benefit of a regular and of a consistent form of an exercise. And that very same loss is then able to show up not just as a state of a weakness, but also as a state of an instability, as a state of a poor bladder control, and as a profound and a deep loss of a confidence in your very own daily life. And all of the many different and distinct consequences of all of this can be very profound. And a woman who had once been able to walk with a great deal of an ease may then begin to fear the possibility of a falling. And the simple and the pure act of a laughter, which had once been a very simple and a very pure form of a joy, may then be able to become a source of a profound and of a deep sense of a worry. And the very same pelvic floor exercises that are most commonly known as the Kegels are able to strengthen your very own bladder control. And I had also then asked her to be able to set a timer for herself in order to be able to stand up and to be able to walk for just 5 short minutes of her own time on every single hour. And all of these had not at all been any kind of a dramatic or of an overwhelming change, but they had, in fact, been able to make a very dramatic and a very profound difference. And within just 2 short months, Gloria had then been able to walk back into my very own office with a beautiful and a brilliant smile on her very own face. "The leaking is now so much better," she had said, "and I am now able to feel so much more steady once again. And I do not at all feel so very helpless anymore. And this is exactly what I so very deeply and so very profoundly want for all of you to be able to hear. Your very own body is not at all broken. It is, in fact, just simply and purely responding to the very same way that you are able to live. And even in your very own 70s or in your very own 80s, you can still be able to rebuild a great deal of your own personal strength, of your own personal stability, and of your very own personal sense of a confidence. And you do not at all need to be joining any kind of an expensive gym or of engaging in any kind of an intense workout. All that you truly and completely need is just some very simple and of some very consistent form of a movement, and the profound and the beautiful willingness to be able to listen to your very own body. And as we begin to close this very personal and this very profound conversation, let's now take just a moment to be able to step back and to be able to look at the much bigger and the much more comprehensive picture of all of this. And across all of these very same 5 parts of our discussion today, we have been able to explore just how all of the many different and distinct solitary habits, all of those very quiet and of those very subtle routines that are at first able to seem so very harmless, can be able to ripple out all across your very own life. And they can, in fact, be able to drain your very own energy. They can be able to strain your very own heart. They can be able to cloud your very own memory. They can be able to distance you from your very own loved ones. And they can also be able to weaken your very own body. But we have also been able to see for ourselves that none of all of these very same outcomes are in any way fixed. And with a profound and a deep sense of an awareness, and with some very small and of some very intentional changes, you can be able to restore your very own vitality, your very own sense of a connection, and your very own profound sense of a joy. And your very own body is able to speak to you on each and every single day of your own life. And a sense of a fatigue, of a brain fog, of an isolation, and of a weakness are not at all any kind of a personal failure on your part. They are, in fact, just simply and purely some very clear and of some very direct messages that it is now time for you to be able to adjust, to be able to bring in some more of a movement, some more of a connection, and some more of a nourishment for your very own mind and for your very own spirit. And the very greatest and the very most profound wisdom that you can be able to find in this particular stage of your own life is not at all to be able to ignore all of these very same signals, but it is, in fact, to be able to honor them. And by simply and purely being able to do so, you are not at all only able to protect your very own personal health. You are also, in fact, able to reclaim the very same fullness of your very own golden years. So I will now be sure to leave all of you with this one final and very important reflection. Have you ever been able to notice for yourself just one single and simple habit that may, in fact, be holding you back? And if so, then what very gentle and what very subtle shift could you be able to make for yourself, starting as early as today, in order to be able to move a little bit closer to a state of a strength, of a clarity, and of a profound sense of a connection? And I would be so very honored to be able to hear all of your very own personal thoughts. And I would be so very grateful if you would please be sure to share your very own personal story with all of us in the comments section below. And you may never at all be able to know just whose very own life your very own words may be able to touch. And if this particular conversation has been able to resonate with you in any way, I would so very warmly and so very sincerely want to be able to invite all of you to be able to subscribe to our channel. And here, we are committed to being able to create some very honest and of some very compassionate content that has been specifically designed for women who are just like you. Women who are able to want not just some longer lives, but also some much fuller and some much richer ones. And together, we can all work to make all of these very same years not at all a time of a decline, but a profound and a beautiful time of a renewal. And I would now like to be able to thank all of you so very much for having been able to spend this valuable time with me today. I'm DrLilyStones, and it has been my very own personal and my very own profound honor to be able to walk with all of you through this very important and this very integral journey. And may you now be able to move forward with a great deal of a confidence, with a great deal of a strength, and with the profound and the beautiful knowledge that it is never, ever too late for you to be able to feel so very deeply and so very profoundly alive once again. And before we close, let me remind you this video is for educational purposes only. It does not replace medical advice. Every woman's body is unique. If you are experiencing pain, significant changes, or have personal concerns, please consult with your healthcare provider. Your well-being deserves personalized care.